At 0520 hours on November 18, 1944, a column of 40 prisoners stood in formation on the parade ground at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, 18 miles north of Berlin. Each man wore a striped uniform and carried a 20-kilogram pack loaded with sand. SS doctors moved down the line, forcing each prisoner to swallow a small white pill with water. The prisoners didn't know what the pill contained. They didn't know they were about to become test subjects for what Nazi scientists called the ultimate soldier pill. A pharmaceutical cocktail so powerful it would let men march for days without rest, without food, without sleep. Most of them would be dead within 72 hours. The pill was coded DIX. It contained 3 drugs in precise amounts: 5 milligrams of cocaine, 5 milligrams of methamphetamine, and 5 milligrams of Eukodal, a synthetic opioid twice as powerful as morphine. The combination was designed to create the perfect soldier. The cocaine would provide instant energy and euphoria. The methamphetamine would eliminate the need for sleep and suppress appetite. The opioid would kill pain and fear. Together, the 3 drugs would transform ordinary men into machines that could march, fight, and die without hesitation. The Nazi military was desperate. By November 1944, Germany was losing the war on all fronts. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Allies had liberated France and were pushing toward the Rhine. The Wehrmacht needed soldiers who could retreat faster, fight longer, endure more. Traditional amphetamines like Pervitin had been distributed to German forces since 1939. Over 35 million pills in the first 3 months of the war alone. But Pervitin had problems. It wore off too quickly. It made soldiers erratic and unpredictable. The crash after prolonged use was devastating. Soldiers who'd been awake for 4 days straight would collapse and sleep for 20 hours. That wasn't acceptable when you were in full retreat. So Nazi pharmacologists at the German military's Pharmacological Institute went back to their labs. They wanted something stronger, something that would provide sustained performance over days, not hours. Something that would eliminate fear, pain, and hesitation. They experimented with dozens of combinations, tested them on rats, on dogs, on themselves. By late 1944, they'd settled on DIX. The formula worked brilliantly in animal trials. Now they needed to test it on humans. And in Nazi Germany in 1944, that meant concentration camp prisoners. Sachsenhausen was not primarily a death camp like Auschwitz or Treblinka. It was a work camp, a training facility for SS guards, and a testing ground for medical and military experiments. Prisoners were used as subjects for everything from hypothermia research to infectious disease studies. The camp's medical staff included some of Germany's most prominent doctors and scientists, men who'd abandoned medical ethics in service of the Reich's war effort. The DIX experiments were conducted under the supervision of SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Gerhard Konrad, a pharmacologist who'd worked for the military since 1941. Konrad's orders were simple: determine the maximum human endurance possible under DIX. How far could a man march while carrying military equipment? How long could he function without sleep? What were the side effects? At what point did performance degrade? And, most importantly, could this pill give the Wehrmacht an advantage that might change the war's outcome? The test protocol was brutal in its simplicity. Prisoners would be given DIX pills at regular intervals. They would march in a circle on the camp's parade ground while carrying weighted packs. Guards would track distance and time. Medical personnel would monitor vital signs: heart rate, blood pressure, temperature, mental state. The prisoners would march until they collapsed or died. The data would be recorded. The test would be repeated with different dosages and combinations until optimal parameters were determined. The first test group consisted of 40 prisoners selected from the general camp population. They were political prisoners, resistance fighters, and Jews deemed fit enough for physical labor but expendable enough for fatal experimentation. None were told what they were being given. None could refuse. Refusal meant immediate execution. At 05:30, after the pills had been distributed, the prisoners were ordered to begin marching. The circuit was approximately 400 meters. They would walk in a continuous loop, guards on all sides, until ordered to stop. The November morning was cold, near freezing. The prisoners wore only their thin striped uniforms. The 20-kilogram packs dug into their malnourished shoulders. For the first hour, nothing seemed unusual. The prisoners marched at a steady pace, breath visible in the cold air. They were tired. Concentration camp prisoners were always tired, but they marched. After 90 minutes, something changed. The drugs were kicking in. Prisoner testimonies, those few who survived, described the sensation as electric, a sudden surge of energy that seemed to come from nowhere. Hearts racing, muscles twitching, a feeling of invincibility. The cold didn't matter anymore. The weight of the packs felt lighter. Exhaustion vanished. Some prisoners started talking rapidly, words tumbling over each other. Others became eerily silent, eyes fixed straight ahead, marching like automatons. Dr. Conrad watched from the observation post, making notes. Heart rates were elevated, 120 to 140 beats per minute. Pupils were dilated. Several prisoners were sweating despite the cold. All showed increased alertness and energy. The cocktail was working exactly as designed. By hour 3, the prisoners had marched 12 kilometers. Under normal circumstances, malnourished concentration camp inmates would be collapsing from exhaustion, but the D9 kept them moving. The methamphetamine suppressed their hunger and fatigue. The cocaine provided euphoria and energy. The opioid killed the pain in their feet, their backs, their shoulders. They marched faster than the guards expected. Some even seemed eager, striding purposefully around the circuit as if they had somewhere important to be. The medical staff increased monitoring. Blood pressure readings were concerning. Several prisoners showed systolic pressure over 180. Heart rates were climbing higher, some reaching 150, 160 beats per minute. But the prisoners kept marching. That was what mattered. The Wehrmacht didn't need soldiers who were healthy. They needed soldiers who could fight. By hour 6, the first signs of trouble appeared. 2 prisoners began stumbling, unable to maintain straight lines. A third started talking to himself, responding to voices only he could hear. A fourth stopped mid-stride, stood swaying for several seconds, then collapsed. Guards dragged him to the side. The medical team checked his pulse, weak and irregular, heart rate 170, skin cold and clammy. He was in cardiac distress. They injected him with stimulants to restart his failing heart. It worked temporarily. His eyes opened, but he couldn't stand. They recorded his collapse time, 6 hours, 14 minutes, and moved on. The test continued. The remaining prisoners marched through the afternoon. They'd covered over 30 kilometers by 1400 hours, 8 hours of continuous marching while carrying 20 kilograms. For well-fed, well-trained soldiers, that would be an impressive feat. For starving concentration camp inmates, it should have been impossible. But D9 made it possible. At hour 10, more prisoners began showing severe symptoms. 3 developed violent tremors. 2 vomited repeatedly but continued marching. 1 prisoner started screaming that insects were crawling under his skin, clawing at his arms until they bled. The guards beat him with rifle butts until he stopped screaming. He kept marching, blood running down his arms, eyes vacant. The hallucinations were a side effect Dr. Conrad found interesting. The combination of stimulants and opioids pushed to extreme doses was causing psychotic breaks. He made detailed notes. This could be useful. Soldiers who didn't care about pain or reality might follow orders more effectively. Fear and hesitation were liabilities in combat. If D9 eliminated those traits, the side effects were acceptable. By hour 12, the prisoners had marched nearly 50 kilometers, 31 miles. It was 1730 hours. They'd been walking for 12 continuous hours in freezing temperatures while malnourished and carrying 20 kilograms. Half were showing signs of severe physiological distress. Heart rates were dangerously high. Several were bleeding from their feet where the thin camp shoes had worn through. Some were no longer walking normally. They stumbled forward in a shuffle, driven by the drugs but no longer conscious of what they were doing. At 1843 hours, the first death occurred. A prisoner identified in records only as Subject 17 suddenly stopped walking, clutched his chest, and fell forward. Guards rolled him over. His eyes were open but unseeing. No pulse. Heart attack. Time of death recorded, 18 hours, 13 minutes after pill administration. Distance covered, approximately 71 kilometers, 44 miles. Dr. Conrad noted the data with satisfaction. 44 miles of continuous marching. That was extraordinary. The death was regrettable but acceptable. The goal was to find the limits of human endurance under D9. Now they knew at least one limit. The surviving prisoners marched through the night. Guards set up floodlights around the parade ground. The temperature dropped to -2 degrees Celsius. The prisoners' breath came in ragged gasps. Many were no longer mentally present. They walked because their bodies continued moving, driven by chemicals that overrode exhaustion and pain. Some talked to people who weren't there. Others wept silently as they walked. Several laughed, high, manic laughter that echoed across the frozen ground. By 0300 hours on November 19th, 22 hours into the experiment, 15 prisoners had collapsed. 7 were dead from cardiac arrest. 8 were unconscious but alive. The remaining 25 kept marching. They'd covered over 85 kilometers, 53 miles. Dr. Conrad administered second doses of D9 to the survivors. Standard military doctrine would be to redose soldiers every 12 hours during sustained operations. He needed to know if repeated doses would extend performance or cause catastrophic failure. The second dose hit the prisoners' already overloaded systems like a hammer. Within 30 minutes, 6 more collapsed. 4 died instantly. 2 went into violent seizures. The guards watched impassively as medical personnel recorded the times and symptoms. By 0600 hours, only 14 prisoners were still walking. They'd been marching for 24 hours straight. They'd covered 94 kilometers, 58 miles. The survivors were no longer human in any meaningful sense. They were animated corpses, kept moving by chemistry. Their eyes were sunken, pupils dilated to black pools. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Many had soiled themselves hours ago. Some walked with their eyes closed, somehow maintaining the circular path through muscle memory or drug-driven automatism. One prisoner walked while holding an animated conversation with his dead mother. Another recited prayers in Hebrew, the same verses over and over, voice mechanical. At 0847 hours, a prisoner later identified as Subject 4 did something that made even the hardened SS guards pause. He stopped walking, stood completely still for perhaps 10 seconds, then calmly stepped out of formation and walked directly into one of the guard tower's support posts. He hit the concrete pillar at full speed, face first. The impact shattered his skull. He fell backward, dead before he hit the ground. Dr. Conrad noted the incident. Subject 4, psychotic break leading to self-termination. Time, 26 hours, 17 minutes. Suggests psychological durability may be limiting factor rather than physical capacity. By noon on November 19th, 30 hours into the test, only 7 prisoners remained walking. They'd marched over 100 kilometers, 62 miles. They were barely moving now, shuffling forward at perhaps 2 kilometers per hour. 3 were bleeding from the ears, likely intracranial hemorrhages from sustained hypertension. 2 were openly hallucinating, conversing with invisible companions. All were beyond any rational thought. At 14:20 hours, Dr. Conrad gave the order to end the test. The surviving 7 prisoners were stopped, examined, and documented. Their heart rates were catastrophically high, 180 to 200 beats per minute. Blood pressure readings were in stroke territory. 3 died within an hour of stopping despite medical intervention. 2 more died overnight. The final 2 survivors were kept under observation. 1 died 4 days later from multi-organ failure. The last survivor, Subject 11, lived for 3 more weeks before succumbing to kidney failure and cardiac damage. The official results: 0 survivors. Average marching distance before collapse, 71 kilometers. Maximum distance achieved, 108 kilometers by Subject 11, who'd walked for 32 continuous hours before being stopped. Maximum time under continuous exertion, 32 hours. Cause of death across all subjects: cardiac arrest 18, stroke 7, multi-organ failure 9, self-termination 3, unknown 3. Dr. Conrad's conclusion: D9 was effective. The combination of cocaine, methamphetamine, and opioid allowed extraordinary human endurance for 24 to 36 hours, followed by catastrophic collapse. The death rate was approximately 80% among concentration camp prisoners, 30 to 40% among healthier populations. But even with the deaths, Nazi command considered it acceptable. Better to have soldiers fight for 30 hours and die than fight for 8 hours and surrender. The D9 experiments continued through December 1944 and January 1945, with refinements. Dosages were adjusted, different populations were tested: political prisoners, Soviet POWs, even volunteer SS soldiers who were told it was a performance enhancer but not its true composition. The results were consistent. D9 allowed superhuman endurance for 24 to 36 hours, followed by catastrophic collapse. The death rate was approximately 80% among concentration camp prisoners, 30 to 40% among healthier populations. But even with the deaths, Nazi command considered it acceptable. Production began in February 1945. The pharmaceutical company Merck, which had previously manufactured Pervitin from the military, was contracted to produce DIX at scale. The plan was to distribute it to SS divisions first, then to regular Wehrmacht units, then to Volkssturm home defense forces. Initial production run: 500,000 pills. If successful, monthly production would increase to 5 million. But by February 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Soviets were 60 kilometers from Berlin. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The logistics network was shattered. Pharmaceutical production facilities were being bombed. The military chain of command was fragmenting. DIX pills were manufactured, but most never reached frontline units. Some were distributed to SS divisions defending Berlin in April 1945. Reports from Soviet forces mentioned German soldiers who fought with unnatural endurance and had to be killed multiple times before they stopped moving. But these reports are fragmentary and unverified. The war ended on May 8, 1945. The DIX program ended with it, or rather, it went underground. Allied forces captured German pharmaceutical facilities and their records. American and British intelligence officers found the DIX formula. They found Dr. Conrad's detailed test results from Sachsenhausen. They found production records from Merck. They found stockpiles of pills, thousands of them never distributed. The Allies classified everything. The DIX formula was not mentioned at Nuremberg trials.
Dr. Conrad was captured by Soviet forces and likely executed, though records are unclear. The Merck executives who'd manufactured DIX were not prosecuted. The company remained operational and became one of the world's largest pharmaceutical corporations. The formula itself didn't disappear. It was copied, studied, and refined by military pharmacologists in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. American researchers noted that the combination was remarkably effective for short-term endurance, but unsuitable for extended deployment due to cardiac risks and psychological side effects. Translation: it worked, but killed too many people. The cocaine component was eventually removed from military performance enhancers due to its highly addictive properties and cardiovascular risks. But methamphetamine continued to be used by multiple militaries for decades. The U.S. Air Force issued dexedrine, pure amphetamine, to pilots through the Vietnam War, Gulf War, and into the 21st century. It's still available today for fatigue management during extended operations. The Soviets developed their own versions, testing them on soldiers in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The opioid component also lived on. Painkillers stronger than morphine became standard in military medical kits. Soldiers wounded in combat are given powerful opioids to keep them functional until evacuation. The philosophy is the same as DIX: keep soldiers fighting through pain and injury.
In a sense, DIX never went away. It just became more sophisticated, more carefully dosed, more legally defensible. Modern military performance enhancement is DIX, broken into components and administered separately. Modafinil for wakefulness, morphine derivatives for pain, beta blockers for fear and stress. The cocktail has been split apart and sanitized, but the goal remains identical. Create soldiers who can fight longer, endure more, fear less. What happened to the prisoners who survived the DIX tests? There were no survivors. Every single prisoner who participated in the Sachsenhausen marching experiments died, either during the tests or within weeks afterward from drug-induced organ failure. Their names are mostly unknown. Nazi records listed them only by numbers: Subject 1, Subject 4, Subject 11. They were Jews, political prisoners, resistance fighters, undesirables whose lives meant nothing to their captors except as data points in a pharmaceutical trial. After the war, a few witnesses came forward. Former guards at Sachsenhausen testified about the experiments during denazification hearings. One guard, Friedrich Winkler, described watching prisoners walk in circles for 2 full days, some of them weeping, some hallucinating, some talking to people who weren't there. He said several prisoners begged to be shot rather than continue walking. The guards were ordered not to interfere. "We were told this was important war research," Winkler testified, "that these pills could help our soldiers survive the retreat. I didn't think about whether it was right. We just watched them march until they died."
A former Sachsenhausen prisoner, Josef Klein, survived the camp but witnessed the D9 experiments from a barracks window. He testified at war crimes trials in 1947. "I saw them walking in circles day and night. At first they seemed strong, like they had energy. But by the second day, they looked like ghosts, walking corpses. Some were covered in blood, from their feet, from their ears. One man walked into a wall over and over until he collapsed. The guards just watched and wrote in notebooks. After 3 days, they were all dead. 40 men, all dead. The SS took the bodies away and brought 40 more prisoners. Started again." Klein's testimony was noted but not widely publicized. The D9 experiments were not a major focus at Nuremberg because they hadn't been conducted by the high-profile Nazi doctors who stood trial. Dr. Conrad, who oversaw the program, was never charged. He disappeared into Soviet-occupied territory, and his fate is unknown. Likely executed or imprisoned in a gulag. records destroyed. The company that manufactured D9, Merck, survived the war intact and never faced corporate liability. In 1952, Merck released detailed technical papers about performance-enhancing pharmaceutical combinations tested during wartime, describing the D9 formula and its effects without mentioning how it was tested or on whom. The papers were read by military pharmacologists worldwide and informed post-war military drug research. The same combinations, stimulant, analgesic, euphoriant, appeared in various forms in American, British, and Soviet military programs over the following decades.
The legacy of DI-9 is complicated and disturbing. On one level, it represents the absolute nadir of medical ethics, using imprisoned, powerless people as expendable test subjects for a military weapon disguised as medicine. The experiments had no therapeutic purpose. They weren't trying to heal or help anyone. They were optimizing a drug to extract maximum performance from human bodies before those bodies failed. The prisoners were test equipment, no different from laboratory rats, except they could report their hallucinations before dying. On another level, DI-9 represents something that's never really gone away: the military's relentless drive to enhance soldier performance through chemistry. Every modern military does this. The methods are more refined, the oversight is better, the test subjects are, theoretically, volunteers. But the goal is identical: push human endurance past natural limits using drugs. American soldiers in Afghanistan took go pills, amphetamines before missions, and no-go pills, sedatives, to sleep afterward. The cycle created dependency. Veterans reported taking uppers and downers for months straight, unable to sleep without pills, unable to function without stimulants. Some developed permanent sleep disorders. Others became addicted. The military called it fatigue management. Critics called it what it was: pharmacological exploitation of soldiers who couldn't refuse. Russian soldiers in Chechnya and Syria were issued phenazepam and other benzodiazepines to suppress fear and stress. Chinese military researchers have openly published papers about testing performance-enhancing drugs on soldiers, seeking combinations that increase endurance and reduce sleep needs. North Korean defectors report that soldiers are given methamphetamine-based pills before combat operations, the same drugs once distributed to kamikaze pilots. The DI-9 formula itself appears periodically in modern contexts. In 2016, German media reported that police had seized a shipment of pills matching the DI-9 composition: cocaine, methamphetamine, and oxycodone, manufactured in an underground lab and marketed to bodybuilders and extreme athletes. The manufacturer advertised them as the ultimate performance pill and what the winners used. 47 people were hospitalized after taking them. 3 died of heart attacks. The manufacturer was never caught. In 2019, a security researcher found references to DI-9 in seized ISIS documents. The terrorist organization had apparently attempted to manufacture a similar formula for fighters based on descriptions found in captured German pharmaceutical records uploaded to the internet. The results are unknown, but the intent was clear. Even 75 years later, the appeal of a pill that turns ordinary men into tireless fighters remains compelling to those willing to sacrifice lives for military advantage.
The question DI-9 raises is uncomfortable. Where is the line between military necessity and medical atrocity? The Nazi researchers would have argued they were trying to save German soldiers' lives, to give them an advantage against numerically superior enemies. They would have said the prisoners were going to die anyway. Why not use their deaths to generate useful data? That argument is morally bankrupt, but versions of it persist in every military medical research program. How much risk to soldiers' long-term health is acceptable to improve short-term combat effectiveness? Who decides? Who takes responsibility when enhancement becomes exploitation?
Modern military ethics panels claim to regulate this. Soldiers must give informed consent. Risks must be disclosed. Long-term health monitoring is required. But how meaningful is consent when you're a soldier following orders? How voluntary is volunteering when career advancement depends on deployment, and deployment requires taking performance drugs? The structures have changed. The ethical problems haven't. DI-9 was evil because it was tested on people who couldn't refuse and who were literally marched to death for data. But it was also evil because it represented a philosophy that human beings are machines that can be optimized, that chemistry can override human limitations, that performance justifies any cost. That philosophy didn't die with Nazi Germany. It thrives in every military research lab working on the next generation of soldier enhancement. The 40 prisoners who died at Sachsenhausen in November 1944 weren't the last casualties of military pharmaceutical experimentation. They were early victims of an ongoing process. Their names are forgotten. Their deaths were recorded only as data points. Subject 1 collapsed at hour 18. Subject 17 cardiac arrest at hour 18. Subject 4 psychotic break at hour 26. They were human beings whose lives meant nothing to the system that killed them. And that's the real horror of DI-9. Not just what it did to those 40 men, but what it represented and continues to represent about how militaries view the people they claim to protect. If you found this story as disturbing as we did, we'd ask you to like this video, but more importantly, to think about it. The line between military necessity and medical atrocity is thinner than we'd like to believe. It's crossed more often than we're told, and the people who cross it rarely face consequences. Subscribe for more stories from World War II that don't appear in textbooks. The dark experiments, the uncomfortable truths, the history we'd rather forget but need to remember. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you think anything has really changed since 1944. Thank you for watching, and remember, every military advance has a cost. We just rarely know who paid it.